I would like to welcome you to this wonderful and rather unusual conference.
In an open and impartial atmosphere.
Now it's starting now.
We are talking here not just about Hurvat Qeiyafa, we have a question about the kingdom of Judah. If you remember, according to the biblical tradition, you have the time of the judges, which is an agrarian community, and then we have a development into a kingdom, which means that we're moving from agrarian society into urban and to state. Also in archaeology, we have the Iron One, which is a period of, in the hill country, a period with, of small hamlets. About 400 such small sites have been excavated over the years. And later we have urbanized centers like Lachish, Jerusalem, and other sites. And the big question is when this sociological process took place. If you take the biblical tradition, it's about 1000 BC. And then came some minimalist theories that said, no, it was not in the 10th century, and it was not in Judah, it was first in the kingdom of Israel, and it was in the 9th century, or the middle of the 9th century. So they changed the geography, and then changed the chronology by 150 years. And then came the idea that Judah became a kingdom only 200 years, or maybe 300 years later, only before the Sennacherib campaign. So there is debate about when this sociological process took place in Judah. And if you take the highest chronology and the lowest chronology that has been proposed over the years, altogether there are about 300 years differences between the highest and the lowest. This is more or less the situation. And Khirbet Qeiyafa is situated in Judah, in the valley of Elah, on the border between Judah and Philistia, not far away from Gat, the city of Gat, in the valley of Elah. And the site was known already 160 years ago. A French traveler, Victor Guérin, visited the place at about 1850 BC. And since then, the site was served from time to time, 160 years altogether, and nobody was thinking it's something special. But then even not just the sociological process from agrarian community into a state coming into consideration, but the whole biblical tradition. Because according to the biblical tradition, David ruled at about 1000 BC, well, it's not written in the Bible that Jesus was 1000 years after David. But if you take Egyptian chronology and biblical chronology, and we don't have too much time to go into it, so David ruled more or less at about 1000 BC. Now, if indeed urbanism took place in Judah at 1000 BC, it's supporting the idea that the Bible has some historical memories embedded in it. But if urbanism took place only 200 years later, or 300 years later, it means that we cannot accept the biblical tradition as representing historical or accurate historical memories. And you can see here the debate. Earlier scholars talked about 100% of the biblical tradition as representing accurate historical memories. And then came the minimalists and maybe only 0, maybe 20%, maybe 25%, okay? So it's not just Khirbet Qeiyafa, it's not just David, it's the old biblical tradition under question here. For thousands of years, the biblical tradition has been accepted as representing accurate historical memories. You can see here 3 of the founded fathers of the discipline, Odbait, Mazar, Yadin, and they didn't question the biblical tradition. But then, over the years, we got more and more information and more ideas, and also sociological processes that took place in the 20th century, or the second part of the 20th century. And then we have the development of deconstructive approaches, Derrida and Foucault and other philosophers, and all this structure of knowledge has been put under heavy questions. And then the most extreme one developed in Copenhagen and then in Sheffield in the early 1980s. They came with the idea that all the biblical tradition was written in the Hellenistic period, which is about 700 years after the time of David. And then it's basically, all we have here is basically mythological figures, and David never existed. I will talk about it later, but I want you to know that today we can see that even the minimalist theories went 3 phases. And in the lecture I will talk about these 3 phases. The first phase is the mythological paradigm. Then we have the chronology paradigm, and today we have the ethnic paradigm. So remember these things, okay? And I will talk about them during the lecture. If you look at Albright, one of the founding fathers, I already mentioned him. So in 1961, he wrote an article about Abraham the Hebrew. And he understood Abraham, the patriarch, as a historical figure, coming from Mesopotamia, go to Egypt, and so on and so forth. But then in 2002, a very important or very influential research claims that Abraham is a mythological figure and it never really existed. So we don't know much about the Abraham. What about the patriarch? They mentioned these camels, and in archaeology we know that camels arrived only on the 12th century BC. So also the patriarch with questions mark. Then what about people of Israel as slaves in Egypt? We don't have any historical document or any archaeological data that can really support this tradition. Then what about the Exodus? Some archaeologists diving in the Red Sea trying to find the chariot of the pharaohs, but nothing was found so far. And then what about the people of Israel wandering in Sinai for 40 years? Between the Six-Day War and the peace agreement with Egypt, Israeli archaeologists did a lot of surveys in Sinai. Prehistoric sites were excavated, later sites were excavated, but nothing was found about a group of people crossing in the late 13th century in Sinai. So again, we don't have data, archaeological data. We don't have any historical information about such events. Then the walls of Jericho, that people of Israel already entering Canaan, and what's happened with Jericho? Catalin Canyon excavated in Jericho, and we don't have a late Bronze city at Jericho at the time. So again, Jericho is not supporting this tradition. And Joshua, the biblical tradition claims that the Canaanite cities has been destroyed in one condensed military activities. But today we know that the Canaanite city has been destroyed, and it's a long process that more than 100 years. Some cities have been destroyed in the 13th century BC, and some of them only in the 12th century BC. So again, this is not, archaeology cannot support the idea of Joshua. And then what about the time of the judges? Did really Samson kill the lion? It's a bit mythological or folkloristic story. And they continue as the minimalist ideas continue stage after stage. And then what's about David? And you see here the biblical saga of King David. And you see the crown, how it was created by throwing a stone to the water. And you see how the water jumping. You can see, you don't need to read the book. Just the cover of the book can already show you the idea of the person. So David, the king, is naked. Okay? And then what about the Temple of Solomon? We have a wonderful description of Solomon Temple. Some people claim maybe there was a temple, but the biblical text is not telling us at all about the real Solomon Temple. And some people say there was never a temple in Jerusalem, and it's only a verbal icon. And there's even ideas that the old beautiful text about Solomon Temple is actually the temple built by the return of Zion. So it's a temple from the 5th century BC that described in the biblical text, and they moved it 500 years earlier to the time of Solomon. And then what's about Kingdom of Judah in the 10th, 9th, 8th century BC? Also, we don't have really much information, and people try to squeeze everything just a few years before the Sennacherib campaign. In 701, we have beautiful description of how Sennacherib conquering Lachish. This cannot be overlooked. So people said, okay, we have Sennacherib in 701, so the Kingdom of Judah has been created 20 years earlier, something like this. Okay, so you can see that how biblical traditions are collapsed according to minimalist ideas, one after the other. Like a domino cube that you put them and they're falling one after the other. So this was basically the idea about the historicity of the biblical text. No wondering, let's say, that minimalist approaches has been developed. Maybe they have indeed some case by questioning this tradition, or at least some of these traditions. So the mythological paradigm says that the United Kingdom never existed. The Kingdom of Israel was established first in the middle of the 9th century BC, and the Kingdom of Judah only about 300 years later. But then about 13 years later, in 1993, Abraham Biran excavated in Tel Dan and found this large part of an Aramaic inscription, and a year later, 2 more fragments. I don't know if you know, but Abraham Biran was the first PhD student of Albright. So he closed the circle in a way. And Avraham Biran found this inscription, and in this inscription the Aramaic king, probably Hazael, claims that he killed 70 kings, and he killed a king from Israel and a king from the house of David. And it's interesting, he's not saying I killed a king from Israel and a king from Judah. It's a king from Israel and a king from the house of David. So what is house of David? And minimalist scholars were of course in big shock, and they said that this is a forgery, and then they said it's not really house of David in Aramaic and Hebrew, it means Bet David. And the idea that it's a dynasty created by David. But they said, no, it's not house of David, it's a place name. Like we have Ashdod, so it's Bet Dod. Okay, all kind of interpretations has been suggested, but it's very clear when you compare it to other Aramaic inscriptions that when they describe a king, they don't describe him by the personal name usually, but by the founded father of the dynasty. So the mythological paradigm collapsed. David is indeed a historical figure. From 1993, we have a scientific proof that David was indeed a historical figure. And 3 years later came this law chronology paradigm. And what is the law chronology paradigm? The idea is very simple. Okay, there was David, he was sitting in a tent in a small village called Jerusalem, but in the time of David there was no kingdom, and no administration, and no army, and no fortifications, and we are still talking about agrarian community. And only later, 100 years or 200 years or 300 years later, only then urbanism started in Judah. This is the idea of the law chronology paradigm. So it's in a way a bypass for Tel Dan Stila, keeping the same conclusion, but giving another explanation. And this is where our excavation at Khirbet Qeiyafa started. This was the background. 2007, we started and we excavated for 7 seasons. And as you can see, it's a beautiful site, very photogenic. You can see the city wall without any excavations, and we could walk around the city wall and see where the gates are located. So we excavated 2 gates. And just after the 2nd season, we have a beautiful inscription, which was published by Chagai Misgav, which is sitting here in the audience. And a few years later, we have another inscription, and we have a lot of animal bones and metal object and cultic object. And what really happens at this site is like it's a biblical Pompeii in a way. It was built, it was suddenly destroyed after 20 or 30 years. Everything was buried inside, and we don't have later Iron Age material to make contamination. If the next time that the site was inhabited is only in the Hellenistic period, 700 years later. So if you have some sherd, Hellenistic sherd, going inside, it's very clear that they are not Iron Age, but Hellenistic. You know, in archaeology, there's always some mixture between levels. So in this case, we really have a kind of biblical Pompeii. It existed for 1 generation, destroyed, and was preserved like this. And the nice thing that we have a city. We didn't excavate just a room here or part of a room there. We have a whole city. And the city is about 23 dunam, or 2.3 hectare. We have 1 gate here in the south, another gate in the west. We have a casemate city wall that encircle the site. And what is interesting about the casemate city wall, it means that it's hollow wall. It's not solid, but you have rooms, and people can enter into these rooms. And if you look at the entrance into the casemate, you see 1 entrance here, a 2nd, a 3rd, and a 4th. And here again, the entrances into the casemates are always away from the gate. So I think that they started with a gate, and then one group built the city wall to the left, another group built it to the right, and they continue like this, encircling the site. The same happening here in the western gate. You see another gate here, and look at the opening. You see they continue away from the gate here and away from the gate here. So there was probably 4 units building the city. 1 gate, and then 2 groups working to this direction, another gate, and another 2 groups working to this direction. And think about it, when 1 group starting to work from this side to where the other gate, and another group working from this gate to the other gate, what will happen in the middle? There will be a meeting point. And in this meeting point, the orientation of the openings of the casemate has to be changed. Okay, so we decided that we want to find a meeting point. There should be 2 meeting points like this, 1 in the south and 1 in the north. So we started in the north. Look at area E. You see here the entrances. They're away from this gate. So we opened here a few meters. Altogether, we had to excavate 50 meters along the city wall, and here is the bingo. You see two openings, one near the other? From this gate up to here, the openings are away from this gate. From here all the way up here, the openings are away from this gate, and this is an opening near an opening. And there should be another meeting point somewhere here. So I think that the conclusion is that this is a well-planned city. Before they put the first stone, they knew how the city going to look like. And this is the amazing things about this site, that we have a planned city in this place. And then another interesting thing about the urban planning, you have a gate. When you enter the city, what do you see here? East of the gate, houses. But what do you see here, west of the gate? You have a piazza. You see we have a gate piazza, and the first house starting only after 20 meters. The same pattern is here. You have the gate. Here, north of the gate, you see the houses. But what's happened south of the gate? You have 30 meters of an open space. So we have gate and gate. We have a gate piazza and a gate piazza. And on top of all this, what's happened here in the first room adjacent to the piazza here and the first room adjacent to the piazza here, we discovered cultic activities. Okay, so we can see that cultic activities are associated with the gates and the gate piazzas. We really have here a symmetrical pattern between the two gates. And then what else are we need in a city? A central place where the municipality. Okay, so this is over here on top of the site in the highest part. You can see a much bigger building than all the lower building that has been excavated down here. And over here we can have what we call the tripartite building or pillar building. This is a central storage place. It's not a dwelling like what we have over here and over here, but it's a more public nature for central storage. And we sent olive pits for radiocarbon dating to Oxford University. First we have 4 samples, 10 samples, now we have 28 samples. And what are the dating? If indeed urbanism took place here at 900, these are the specific sample. This is 1000 BC, this is 900 BC, this is 800 BC, and here it should be 700 BC. If Judah became a state in the end of the 8th century, all the samples should be here. But look, where are they? A bit or after 1000 BC. So in this moment, the low chronology paradigm collapsed. And we also have a full page in the New York Times, the National Geographic magazine, and BBC, and CNN, and all the media in the world kept on writing about Khirbet Qeiyafa, because it was a fortified city in Judah from the time of King David. And people ask me, who makes such wonderful PR for you? I said, King David. But it's not so simple as you can imagine, because 10 days after we published the first report on Khirbet Qeiyafa, and we didn't even talk if it's a Judean or not Judean, 10 days after we published the first article on the site, there was already an article in an internet journal that claims that Khirbet Qeiyafa, because it's on the border between Philistia and Judah, it's a Philistine site. And here we move into the third paradigm, okay, which I'm calling it the ethnographic paradigm. So if you look here, you can see the development of minimalist theories. First came the idea that everything is mythological. But thanks to the Tel Dan inscription or stela, it turned out to be wrong. And then came low chronology paradigm, which is a bypass for Tel Dan stela. But then the dating of Khirbet Qeiyafa indicates that low chronology is not working. And what was the response? That Khirbet Qeiyafa is not Judean, it's Philistine. And the same scholar who wrote that it is Philistine site, 4 years later he wrote that this is Canaanite site. It's interesting that in the article about Canaanite Qeiyafa, he didn't mention that 4 years earlier he wrote that it was Palestinian site. And then 4 years later, believe it or not, he wrote a third article about Khirbet Qeiyafa, and then he said that Khirbet Qeiyafa is such a complicated case, we should stop writing articles about it. This was accepted for publication, all these articles. When I sent a response, the journal refused to publish it. So you also see that there are a lot of politics behind all these things. It's not just King David. Anyhow, today the big question is, who lived in Khirbet Qeiyafa? This is the main question today. Okay, the ethnographic paradigm, who lived in Khirbet Qeiyafa? And you can see here the idea that it was Philistine. We think that this is Judean, then other people suggested it's Canaanite, then another scholars wrote, or 2 scholars, that this was built by King Saul. So King Saul is okay, that David is not okay. So you can see that Philistine, Canaanite, Judean, Philistine, or Israelite, And some people said it's a local community who lived in this region. It's not Canaanite, and not Israelite, and not this, and not that. So a lot of interpretation about who lived and who built Khirbet Qeiyafa. Now the question is, how do you solve such a question? Okay, this is the methodological question, really. And this is basically just the introduction to my lecture in a way. Now we should start the real lecture about why Khirbet Qeiyafa is a Judean or Canaanite or whatever it was. This is the main question. So, is Hurvat Qeiyafa a Judean city? This is the main question. And what is really the methodology? The methodology is to take the various aspects of the material culture, like you can see the urban planning, the cooking habits, the administration, the writing, the geopolitical location, the cult, even the metallurgy, and to compare it. We know what has been found in our site. We can compare it to Philistine sites. People excavated in Ashdod, and Ashkelon, and Gat, and Ekron, and we have a lot of data about the Philistine material culture. Then we can compare it to Canaanite site. Also, we don't have Canaanite anymore really in the 10th century, but we can compare it to Canaanite site of the 12th and 11th centuries BC, like in Megiddo and Tanakh, Bet-Shan, and other sites. Then we can compare Khirbet Qeiyafa with site in the Kingdom of Israel. We can compare it to Tel Rehov and to Megiddo, but later Megiddo, Iron Age Megiddo, and to Hatzor, and so on and so forth. And we can see. And another possibility is to compare Khirbet Qeiyafa with site in Judah that existed in the 10th century BC, like Arad and Beersheba. They are not urbanized centers yet, but still they were excavated. We know a lot about the animal bones, the pottery, the metal object, and so on and so forth. And this is really the methodology, to take the material excavated in our site and to compare it with other units in this region. Now, I don't have much time to develop every aspect, so I want to show that we have this book, very small one, because I want people to read it. If I would publish a book 500 pages, nobody will read it. But this one, just 160 pages, I think, or so on. A lot of pictures and maps, and so on and so forth. And the name of the article, Debating Khirbet Qeiyafa, a fortified city in Judah from the time of King David. And I said that nothing is controversial in the title of the book. Khirbet Qeiyafa, of course, this is the name of the site. It's already known for 160 years. A fortified city, it's fortified city. We have a very clear city wall. Judah, this is the area of Judah. The geographical area is not Philistia and not Israel. It's in Judah. And it's from the time of King David because of the radiocarbon dating. But what is controversial is the relationship between Qeiyafa and David. Okay, this is the controversial aspect of the site. Okay, so let's see where are we standing, the urban planning. In this lecture, I will not talk about all of them, but because we don't have too much time. But the urban planning is very important here. And this is the Kazmat city wall and the private houses that are abutting each other. You see the private houses? They're connected to the Kazmat. And people who lived in the house could use the Kazmat that abutting the house. And then you have a problem here because the city wall is public. The houses are private. But if the Kazmat is part of the building, you have public and private combined one with the other. Where do we have this type of urban planning? Where do we have Kazmat city wall and houses and they are combined together? There are 5 examples like this. In Tel Natzbe near Ramallah, not far away from Jerusalem. We have it in Bet Shemesh. We have it in Khirbet Qeiyafa. We have it in Tel Bet Mirsim, south, further to the south, and we have it in Tel Sheva. So we have it in 5 sites. All these 5 sites are in Judah. So let's talk about the cooking habit. We have a lot of animal bones at Khirbet Qeiyafa, not 100,000, but I don't remember, 50,000 animal bones or very large number of animal bones. We have sheep, goat, and cattle. We don't have even one pig bone at the site of Khirbet Qeiyafa in the Iron Age city. If you go to a Philistine site, up to 20% of the animal bones are pigs. So you can see that the people at Khirbet Qeiyafa didn't consume pork, and so the site cannot be Philistine, because if you go 12 kilometers to Gat, you have 10-15% of the animal bones are pigs. Administration, we have jars which have a finger impression on them, and in the Kingdom of Judah we have the Lamelech storage jars, and the Rosette jars, and Lion, and Motzah, and Yahud, and so on and so forth. All of them has impression on the handle. So impressing jars on the handle is typical Judean type of administration. You don't have it in Canaanite, Philistine, or in the Kingdom of Israel. Writing, okay, we'll see the writing. The geopolitical location, we are in the Valley of Elah. The cult, I think I mentioned something about cult here. If not, I'll talk without a slide. I'm going fast about the most interesting part, I know, but the data is here in the book and you can read about it. But also metallurgy, that is not even mentioned here, but it's only recently we finished to analyze the metal object. We have in the city about 100 metal objects, some of them made from bronze and some of them made from iron. And when you take the tools, you can see that 2/3 of the tools are made from iron and only 1/3 made from bronze. If you go to Philistine site, almost all the tools made from bronze. If you go to Megiddo and site in the north, most of the metal objects in the north made from bronze. But if you go to Arad and Beersheba in this time, most of the vessels are made from iron. So you can see that Qeiyafa is again more typical. The metallurgical technology is similar to a site in Judah and not site in other units. And by the way, this in itself is quite interesting because in the biblical tradition, they're telling us that the Israelites didn't know how to work iron and they went to the Philistine to sharpen the iron vessels. And archaeology show, in this case, Qeiyafa and Arad and other sites show you that this tradition doesn't fit very well. Text and archaeology are not fitting here. There's some contradiction between the two. So I'm not saying that everything is clear. The situation is very complicated, and even a site like Qeiyafa that maybe proved King David, in other aspects, it proves that the biblical tradition is more complicated. We don't know how it was created, we don't know when it was written exactly, so things are not easy. I'm not saying that life are easy, but this is the situation. You should be aware of it. Okay, so the urban planning is typical Judean. Writing. Writing is very important for two reasons. This is the famous Qeiyafa Ostrakon, found in 2008, published in 2009. I still remember that we ordered Chagai Misgav and asked him, do you want to publish it? He said, yes, of course. I said, in one condition, you publish it in 1 year. I didn't want it to be like the Dead Sea Scrolls, you know, that after 50 years, they were still unpublished. So this was the main. And it's very complicated. I'm sure we can talk just about this object, about this inscription for an hour. I will not do it to you. This is the second inscription that we found at Khirbet Qeiyafa. The first word is broken, and we don't really know what it is exactly. Then we have a word divided. Then we have Eshba'al, a word divider, Ben, son of, and then the father name is Beda. What is Beda? We don't know. This name is not mentioned in the biblical text, and it was never found in any inscription. So it's a new name. Maybe it's well, I don't know. Anyhow, Ishbaal is an interesting name because we have 5 people called Ishbaal in the biblical tradition, and they're mentioned in 10th century sources. This name was not in use in the 7th century or the 8th century or the 9th century BC. So also it has a limited chronological distribution. And it was published all over the world, and you can see here that we were invited to Prime Minister's office to show him the inscription. And this is the whole story of archaeology and politics, you know, mingle with each other. But what is important to our point is where do we have early inscription? This inscription, I didn't talk much about them, but the script is not Hebrew or Phoenician. This is still what is usually called Canaanite or Proto-Canaanite script. So this is the first alphabet invented by the Canaanite. And today, from the 10th century BC, we have 5 examples. Here you see only 4. The Khirbet Qeiyafa Ostrakon, and then the Khirbet Qeiyafa jar inscription. But a year later, this inscription was published from Bet Shemesh, and another year later from Jerusalem, Elat Mazar published this one. And there's another inscription found at Tel Safi in Gat, which has 7 letters on it. Now, if you took these inscriptions, Jerusalem, Bet Shemesh, and Qeiyafa, where we have 4 out of 5 inscriptions known from the early 10th century BC. Are they in Philistia? No. Are they in Canaanite sites? No. Are they in the Kingdom of Israel? No. Where are they? They are in Judah. And why do we have suddenly such flourishing appearance of inscriptions? Because when you have a kingdom, kingdom is not something abstract. When you have a kingdom, orders are sent from the center to the periphery, and the periphery had to send report to the center. And probably these reports were written on papyrus, on some perishable material. But it's increased the number of people who knew how to read and write. Not 100% of the population, but not zero. Maybe 2%, maybe 5%. As more and more people knew how to read and write, the byproduct will be some inscription in ink or some incisions on pottery. And why it's in Judah and not in other units? That's the point here. But writing has also another important aspect. And this is the accuracy of the biblical tradition. If people didn't know how to read and write in the 10th and 9th centuries BC, they couldn't preserve historical memories in these hundreds of years. But if you have writing already in the early 10th century BC, it means that historical knowledge could be documented and preserved from generation to generation. And this relating to, maybe not to the Enigma of the 10th century, but it's relating to accuracy of biblical memories. Because writing was practiced in Judah in the 10th century BC. And the geopolitical location, where is Khirbet Qeiyafa? It is exactly between Socho and Azekah, in the valley of Elah. And if you remember, the battle of David and Goliath was between Socho and Azekah. So how come we have such a wonderful biblical tradition in this location and in this region and in this era, and on the other side we have this city in the same location and the same period? So there is some tension here between the tradition and the location, the tradition and the site of Khirbet Qeiyafa. And the cult. I can talk about the cult of Khirbet Qeiyafa forever, but I will not do it to you. Don't worry. The point is like this. Altogether in Khirbet Qeiyafa, we excavated about 60 rooms. Okay, now 10 houses and about 60 rooms. And what's happened in these 60 rooms? If you go to Canaanite site, Israelite site, and Philistine site, you have a lot of what we call mother goddess figurines. These are usually naked female figures holding breast. In Khirbet Qeiyafa, even one figurine like this was not found. But as you can see, you didn't find it, doesn't mean anything. But we excavated 60 rooms, 1/4 of the city. We discovered 6 cultic rooms, which has a lot of cultic activity, cultic object in them, and this type of mother goddess figurine was not found. So even the cult of Khirbet Qeiyafa is a bit different. This is an amazing object, maybe the most important object found in Khirbet Qeiyafa, even more important than the inscriptions. And we published a whole book about it. Solomon's Temple and Palace, new archaeological discoveries. What's happened here? You can say, how, from this small object, 30 centimeter, how can you predict anything about Solomon Palace and Solomon Temple? But the text of Solomon Palace and Solomon Temple describe few technical terms, like tzlaot and like shkufim, it's in Hebrew. And what are they? Nobody really understood them. And if you take 10 different translations of the Bible from Hebrew to English, each one of them translate these technical terms in the description of Solomon Palace and Temple differently. This building model, which represent elaborate architecture, you can see what we have around the entrance. We have recessed entrances. You see 1, 2, and 3. And look here near the roof. What do you see? You see this rectangular divided into 3. This is what's called triglyphs in classical architecture. So the recessed openings are known in many sites. You can see here one example from Tel Tayanat. You see the entrance and you see the recess. And here you see the triglyphs. And look at the Parthenon in Athens. It's the same motifs that appearing here on the roof of every classical building. And these things already appeared in Khirbet Qeiyafa. Now, if it was just a village, and if we don't have a kingdom, how come we have in Khirbet Qeiyafa a model that shows you the typical royal architecture of the Iron Age? So royal architecture was already known in Judah in the early 10th century BC. And the biblical tradition who describe royal architecture in Jerusalem in the early 10th century BC describe exactly this type of architecture. Beams of the roof organized 3 together and recessed opening. And this was really amazing discovery. So royal architecture that characterized the Iron Age and is known from Lebanon on ivories, in Syria, Tel Tayanat, Cyprus, Tamasos, and Iran in Persepolis appeared for the first time in the early 10th century BC at Khirbet Qeiyafa. And we were able to suggest a new reconstruction for Solomon Palace and Solomon Temple based on new understanding of few technical terms. So why Khirbet Qeiyafa is a Judean city? I already told the typical Judean urban planning, the cooking habit, the stamped jar handle, which represent Judean typical administration, the inscription, the geopolitical location, and the cult. All these are typical and known in other Judean sites, and they're unknown in Philistia, Canaanite site, and the kingdom of, or site in the kingdom of Israel. And then you can ask me, okay, you convince us about Khirbet Qeiyafa. And then you should ask me, so all this great kingdom of David is one site? Why don't we have level like this in Jerusalem? Why don't we have it in other sites? So what should be the next step? To try to find a second site from the early 10th century BC. And indeed, a few years ago, we discovered the site. The site is called Khirbet El Rai, near Lachish, and on the surface, the same pottery that is found in the city of Khirbet Qeiyafa was found on the surface of this site. So we started excavations here. You see a number of areas, and only in area B. I must say that the 10th century in this site is very meager. It's only in one area, so it was a small village. Now we can write a book, a village and a city from the time of David, okay? But we don't have another fortified city, just a small village. But what is so interesting here is what is under the 10th century. And under the 10th century, we have the 11th and the 12th centuries BC. We have the old sequence of the Philistine culture, and on top of it, a site from the time of David. And this is in itself quite interesting to the local, to research of the Lachish area in the Iron 1 and the early Iron 2A. Only a few rooms were found, but this was horrible destruction, and we have about 60, 70 complete vessels, pottery vessels, uncovered from the level of the early 10th century BC. So I'm concluding now, what can we really say about the historical King David? We can talk about urbanism and not just villages, and you can see that we have pre-planned cities with the opening of the Kazmat and the way it was built. We have, where is Khirbet Qeiyafa? On the border. And also Khirbet Arai, by the way, is on the border. It's facing Ashkelon. We have administration, we have the writing, and we have new cult. We don't have the fertility figurine, and we have the same type of architecture that is known in Solomon Palace. And this is really summarizing the debate. The traditional biblical archaeology talk about, and the biblical tradition talk about a united kingdom, and then it's splitted, has been splitted to Israel in the north, destroyed by the Assyrian, and Judah in the south, destroyed by the Babylonian. Look what the minimalist strategies did. They erased completely the united kingdom. They talk about the kingdom of Israel first, and only after the destruction of Samaria, refugees came to the south, and the kingdom of Judah has been created. This was the hardcore or the original minimalist theories, but Khirbet Qeiyafa showing us that indeed Judah starting already in the early 10th century BC. The kingdom of Israel is over here. What's happened in the north, the enigma of the 10th century, the enigma of the united monarchy, I don't know. I don't think that from one or two sites in the south we can tell about the north. So each area had to be investigated by itself. And if in the north people will find sites like Khirbet Qeiyafa, or from the time of Khirbet Qeiyafa, it will change the picture. Just now, we cannot say more than that, I think.